Most of the front pages are this deepening Gregg Wallace row. As the Star says on the front page, when you're in a really, really, really deep hole, stop digging. This is their cut out and keep crisis management advice for anybody called Greg. It doesn't feel as though Gregg Wallace kind of took the advice over the weekend.
No, he actually got a JCB out and he sort of started digging that hole way deeper. I don't know where the story was going before. It wasn't going well for him, but he certainly just come out and poked his accusers in the eye in the most horrible way, but also in the most sort of, in a way, most guaranteed to sort of engineer a whole new, fresh wave of anger. And it's now largely self-inflicted.
I think we have the Instagram video that Greg issued yesterday morning. Let's have a look. Yeah, Kevin, I mean, maybe he could weather it.
Yeah.
But if sometimes when you come out, you can make it worse.
Yeah, well, it's game over. I mean, that is it. What, does he not like them because they're middle class? Doesn't like them women or their age or just all three? What is it? Where is the crime? You know, what are you accusing him of? It's just incredible. If you were advising him to destroy himself, you would have scripted that. Just dismiss your accusers in the most ridiculous, insulting way. I mean, you've been in PR.
Yeah.
I mean, you had Boris Johnson, you know, who got himself into all sorts of mess.
People.
But you know, that is it. That's it. It's finished.
Totally finished. And actually, it now poses a huge dilemma for the BBC because Gregg Wallace is currently scheduled to appear across the Christmas schedule on special Celebrity MasterChef programmes. But I think, you know, before the weekend of these Instagram videos, when it was still allegations to be investigated, he says, I've done nothing wrong, very clear through his lawyers, the idea he sexually harassed anybody, untrue. But the moment he goes out and sort of picks that fight, suddenly, I mean, very hard to see that they're going to broadcast these programmes.
It almost doesn't matter what happened originally anymore in terms of his future. He's created a fresh and separate reason for being suspended because he's just offended, you know, a huge proportion of the audience.
Well, he denies any wrongdoing.
Yeah.
But somebody speaking like that and dismissing people in that way makes me think you have no idea how to behave. And there's going to be questions for the BBC now because the complaints go back 12 years. Why weren't they acted on earlier? We've seen the disaster for the BBC of Hugh Edwards. We know that a report found they missed opportunities to stop Jimmy Savile and Stuart Hall, who were terrible offenders. Now, Wallace will say, I'm very different to that case. I accept that. But there is something about big institutions, when you have stars, talent, you get complaints, how do you deal with them? And they always seem to be blokes, they always seem to be men, always accused of behaving in a totally inappropriate way that, in some of the previous cases, was clearly unlawful.
Is it big institutions, or is it, in particular, the BBC? Because, you know, if this happens once to an institution, you'd think, that's really bad. If it happens a second time, you'd think, I can't believe it's happened a second time. But this is not even the second time. And you just wonder, how could they be in a position where this wasn't back in 2017 when senior BBC executives were dealing with these complaints? Yeah. Why is it not just ringing massive alarm bells?
The words Philip and Schofield would suggest it's not just the BBC.
That's right.
However, the BBC is such a big corporation with such a big output.
No, but also the repetition of it,
fronts.
Kevin, more than one individual. That's what's distinctive.
Yes, yeah.
I think the BBC builds people up, and that's inevitable, and that's almost, in some circumstances, desirable. But sometimes you create a monster, and the monster cannot be reined in and cannot be sort of held to account even. And I think there's an imbalance, essentially, in who holds the power. People nominally are in charge of the BBC, they're senior executives, but they're nobodies compared to the top talent. And the top talent gets to a position, certainly happened with Hugh Edwards, where they really tell the executives what they want, not the other way around. They stop being an employee, they become bigger than the institution, and that's where it gets really dangerous. And from his kind of intervention last night, he seems to think he's immune. He thought that was going to work. He thought that was actually going to make things better. That's what's slightly demented about all this.
Guito, you are a former director of communications and you know, someone who's worked in public perceptions of individuals for years. It would be natural for anyone to want to fight back when you are in a corner. You know, you want to back yourself if you feel like you're not getting backing. But probably that is the worst time to try and come out and say something publicly. What would your advice have been?
Well, I'm quite gung-ho compared to most people. There's an awful lot of people earning money in communications by, telling people just don't say anything and at which point, what's the point of hiring them? I'm all for sort of taking the battle to the other side, but what was needed last night was humility. What was needed was, I just want to say, while this is being investigated, that I feel extremely sorry for the hurt that I've clearly caused. My intentions were never to do that. I don't believe I am that kind of person. That would have landed very differently. It wouldn't have worked for a lot of people, but the tone would have been different. We'd have thought, he gets it, he realises, and he'd have given the BBC a space where they might find a way through. Instead, he basically went out and said, hi, Big Nose, poke you in the eye.
Don't attack your accusers.
Yeah.
What would you advise him to do now? If he was coming to you and paying you good money, what would you say to him?
Give Nigel Farage a ring and ask him for a seat, and stand for the Reform Party. That's the next move, because he clearly thinks there's a constituency of people who like what he said last night, and I think it reminds me of what's his face had defected from the Tory Party.
But the interesting thing,
reform,
Guito, is not the front of the Sun. Shut your cake hole, Greg. It's not the front of the Daily Mail. BBC warned 4 times about Wallace. I mean, if the Sun and the Mail are on the other side, your media strategy hasn't worked.
You're in deep,
I mean, even your Reform candidate media strategy is not working very well.
OK. So just to point out, Gregg Wallace's lawyers have said that the suggestion he engages in behaviour of a sexual harassing nature is false. But it's a sign of our times, isn't it, that a scandal like this, or perhaps it's a sign of any time, a scandal like this gets the front pages, and other big political stories therefore get shoved off. I think out of all of the headlines that we read there this morning, only one of the papers has got, the government and its new missions to try and reset itself. Is Keir Starmer having to do a relaunch only a couple of months into his government, and that's what he's going to announce this week?
It feels like a reboot, doesn't it? Because it hasn't been going particularly well. It's got to be said. You have the budget, which
the winter fuel allowance
doesn't land well. You get mounting problems. You had Lou Hay, the Transport Secretary, he threw under a bus she was regulating. So you think, right, I'll get my 5 missions. I want the public to focus on what I want them to. Well, good luck to that, because the 5 missions were very, very broad. He avoided the very specifics of Rishi Sunak, if you remember that time. He's going to half inflation.
Well, that was the one thing he managed to do.
Stop the boats and the other 3, which I can't remember now. He's kept
growth, debt, and NHS.
Yeah, well done. That's pretty good. Top of the class. What? I know. But he
sat here for very many hours.
I know. But I suppose it'll gather steam as we get to Thursday.
Well, interestingly, Guito, I think Stop the Boats was one of Rishi Sunak's. But immigration, despite that astonishing revision of figures, that up to June 2023, 1 million people came to this country
1 year.
In 1 year. Absolutely remarkable. Immigration is not one of his 5 missions, Sir Keir Starmer. I find that extraordinary.
I think it's going to be brought in this week. I think they're going to add it as essentially a 6. The one they did...
So they're going to have to reset their reset.
I think it's part of it, Susanna. Pat McFadden, when Starmer's in trouble, he reaches for the bat phone and gets Pat McFadden, who's a cabinet minister, a very safe pair of hands. He said it'll be in the report on Thursday. It's going to be 6 missions. Well, probably a mission impossible.
They had 5 missions, which they announced last year for 10 years, and now they're producing milestones on the missions for 5 years, but the milestones are going to be on different missions to the missions they announced last year,
including
adding in migration.
It just becomes a mess,
that is what's happening, I think.
And we're all going to decide what we really care about in the run-up to the next general election, no matter how much they tell us it's about this. And already you can see a backlash, because if you focus on this bit, you leave out that bit, and then it has 2 things. We think you don't care about that bit, but also civil servants think You don't care about that bit, so we'll take our foot off the pedal on all those things.
Guito, how important is immigration as an issue for the country?
It's absolutely critical, and I'm one of the most pro-immigration people, you know, on the fringes of politics.
Well,
if you like,
migration
but the
exploded
scale
under
of it
Boris
now,
Johnson.
Yeah, well, the scale of it now is off the charts. So I'm all in favour, and I'll make the argument for it being a positive thing that we attract more students to British universities than other universities, skilled labour, etc. But the scale of it now is changing communities, causing deep anxiety, is putting a pressure on public services, and so there has to be a sort of a rethink about this. Crucially, even more important, I think we need to sort of set conditions for people coming here. What is bugging people now is we are tolerant, so we invite people in, quite rightly, based on that tolerance, but we invite people in who don't sign up to that tolerance. There are micro-communities in Britain where they actually think that women should not learn the local language and should be covered up, and where gay men should be stoned. That is not. Unless you sign up for our kind of values, then you should not be as welcome here as a lot of people seem to be. And maybe it's time to start being a bit more assertive about that.
Kevin, immigration has always been a difficult issue for a Labour government, although ironically it was under a Conservative government that said stop the boats and wanted to cut down on immigration, and David Cameron said he wanted it to be in the tens of thousands, under 100,000, and it reached almost 1 million under a Conservative government. But what is Keir Starmer going to do? Is he going to be tough on immigration? Because however much you can see the value of immigration, how vital immigrants are, the work they do, particularly for public services, for the NHS. 1 million people need housing, apart from anything else.
Labour governments have always been tough on it. It's the language that's been different, and controls have always been operated. There's only a minority of people who come in as described by Guito, but you would have to tackle that issue.
After 2004, the immigration from Eastern Europe under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown went up much more than people expected.
And what was it? It was a fraction of what it is now. Brexit was sold in to stop migration. I think it's 3 times net now as high. But it's very difficult for him. He says he's going to be training people up to do jobs that now are offered abroad to migrants. He's smashed the gangs with small boats. Always easier said than done. There's a plan to get people out of hotels, but it's going to take years. Deportations of people who aren't entitled to stay here are up, but there's no magic wand. There's no easy solution. And I think all governments, including this one, have been guilty at times through the rhetoric of making it easy. Nigel Farage, Reform, probably the most hardline, talks about one in, one out. And then the minute you begin to get on the details of that, it all falls apart.
It seems that Labour is going to say this week they're going to set a new milestone target to cut immigration. But the expectation is in the papers that they're not going to say a number. Kemi Badenoch, the new Tory leader, last week said she was going to set a new cap, a number. As we were saying, when David Cameron did that in 2010 and said tens of thousands, it didn't work out so well. What is the right thing to do? Should you actually be setting a number, a cap, an objective?
She was against a cap during the Conservative leadership contest and converted. And you're right, the Conservatives in their manifesto of 2010, 2015, 2017 all talked about net under 100,000, never hit it once. Then Boris Johnson in 2019 said he was going to cut it, and it went up. You can have an arbitrary number, and you might satisfy some people by just bandying it around. But how do you arrive at that number? And why are students counted, say, in the same way as people coming to live here permanently or people coming to work? It's a complete and utter mess.
And however, distasteful the Rwanda policy seemed to people, the idea was to create a disincentive, a deterrent. There is no deterrent now. There's no plan for a deterrent, just as other European countries are starting to talk about not only a deterrent, but of using Rwanda as a deterrent.
So you're talking about illegal immigration.
Yeah.
I think the issue that people see is that is a small proportion. The issue is legal migration. How do you look after... If we want to be a welcoming, generous, supportive country, how do we look after 1 million extra people
the 1 million people
every year?
Was people from Hong Kong, people from Ukraine, people who are coming to be students with their families and people to come and work in social care and the NHS. All of those were legal. Yeah. They all passed a threshold. They all had to get a visa to come. But the legal system at that time allowed in 1 million people.
Look, the legal system was 30 times the size of the Rwanda was about the people on boats. I don't think it was going to work. I think it was cruel, very expensive.
No, but it was
but the net migration legal was 30 times the board people. So when you talk about Rwanda, it's kind of confusing different issues, legal and unlawful. But it was an exceptional year to get to 900,000. And could that go on forever? No, of course it couldn't. People do come here and they do work, and the NHS would collapse without people from other countries who work in it. So when we talk about pressure on public services, they're also taking the pressure off by running those public services. But it was an exceptional year, because you did have people from Hong Kong, you did have people from Ukraine.
Right. You talk about Pat McFadden, the safe pair of hands. In fact, it was pointed out yesterday on the Laura Kunsberg programme that if you see Pat McFadden on a television programme, it suggests the government is in trouble. Yeah. So I'm not sure whether it's actually backfiring now. But he has suggested that Britain's, since we did this historic vote in favour of assisted dying last week, that if you opt for an assisted death, you might have to pay for it. Let's have a listen to what he said. It seems extraordinary to raise this idea that you would pay for it.
You can't leave that hanging, because if this is something that has been approved by Parliament but implemented by a Labour government, then the principles of a Labour government should apply. And that is surely that money is irrelevant to the treatment that is available for you on the NHS.
It's not yet been approved by Parliament.
It's really core. Yeah. But assuming we get to that point, he was suggesting we could get to the point where it is available if you pay for it, but not if you don't. That is really quite shocking.
The bit I wonder about charging, I think, would be totally unacceptable to be charging somebody to, look, when people die in hospital, when they have their life support machines switched off, which happens every day, you don't say you've got to pay to have the doctor come round and do it, or increase your morphine dose or whatever, because that goes on too. The bit I wondered about paying is if you need a judge to approve your application, you need 2 doctors and a judge, would you have to pay to go to court, or would there be a process that the state, the NHS, would pay? And in fact, actually, one of the big arguments against assisted dying, which I back assisted dying, but one of the big arguments against is people might be pushed into it to save money, because, of course, you will. If you've got 6 months, you're terminally ill, you have to be terminally ill, expected to die within 6 months. If you have an assisted death, you will save the NHS money.
But it won't
save the palliative
but not in the courts
going through it. No.
But there's no way any government is going to charge people in the NHS for assisted dying if we get to that point. The vast majority of care in hospitals is either mothers and children at the point of birth, or older people when they are in the last stages of their life. And those are people for whom the NHS is not only free, but prescriptions are free as well. And, there would be some people under 60 who would be in the assisted dying route, but it would be, I would guess, a small proportion of the number. And therefore, the idea that you would ever have a charging system for a small number and the vast majority of people would not pay, it's not going to happen. But isn't there a wider problem here, which is the bill is just starting. It's a private member's bill. At a certain point, the government has to engage and say, well, as a government, what would it mean for the courts? What would it mean for the National Health Service? How are we going to manage this? And at the moment, the government is still standing back and saying, well, we're not really going to comment. We're not going to give you our opinions. They're not even going to publish their assessment of the bill until maybe the report stage, which is quite a long way down the track. At a certain point, doesn't the government have to say, well, if this is a big reform, what does it actually mean?
They've got to own it. They've got to own it in the end.
I would say so.
Because that's the only way it gets
implemented. And it sounded like Pat said there was saying, Pat McFadden basically saying, these are all questions. And we think, yeah, fine, but what's the answer?
Yeah.
But he did touch on something that is one of the reasons I back it in Britain, is if you could afford to go to Switzerland, you can go to the Dignitas clinic, you've got £10,000 or so, you can do that, you have that option. But if you haven't got £10,000 or so, why can't you end your life in Darlington or Dundee.
What you're suggesting is there would be a means-tested
Well, no, I hope
death
not. I hope it's not
system.
going to be like the winter fuel allowance.
Yeah.
No, I think, no, you'd have to have, like the NHS, you'd have to have a service for everybody.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think
it
what
would be
you're...
postcode lotteries, obviously, but...
Yeah, what you're alluding to, Ed, I think, is that if it was a prescription, if you were offered the drug and you weren't in a hospital, then obviously we have a system of prescriptions where some people pay.
That's right.
And then there are sections, as you say, over a certain age where you wouldn't pay.
But the assisted dying will hugely disproportionately apply to people who at the moment get their prescriptions free. But the idea we would suddenly come along and say, I know, but for assisted dying, it's a different rule.
They're free for everybody in
charge...
Scotland and Wales. It's only England under 60s have to pay unless certain categories.
That's right.
Cladding. This seems extraordinary. The horror of the Grenfell Tower tragedy happened back in 2017. We still don't have every building that is affected remediated. And the government is going to say, do it by 2029 or there will be penalties. 12 years to get this fixed. Gito, are you aware of what's gone wrong here?
It is one of those things where, you know, if you start sort of looking at buildings that have a potential issue, then you end up with such a massive, hairy problem with a massive price tag to it at times when nobody wants to spend any more money over there because there's other things that are more pressing, unless you live in the building, at which point there's nothing more important than actually being able to go to sleep at night, not having nightmares about the building going up in flames. So it is horrible, and it's basically working out who's going to pick up that tab. That's the problem, I think.
John's emailed in.
Sorry,
I was just going to say, John's emailed in as one of those unlucky enough to have been blighted by the scandal of cladding. I had hoped this new government would have really taken the gloves off against the developers and builders who created this mess, but developers are running rings around the procedure as they try and dodge making the buildings safe whilst blaming everyone else.
That's right, and that John's use of the word developer is important there because, you know, we think of this being, why won't the landlords sort out the cladding issue in a kind of block of flats for the people who are renting? But if you bought your flat in a block of flats 20 years ago, you own it. It is your responsibility to, to pay the insurance, the service charge, and suddenly it turns out, because of the cladding issue, hugely expensive. The insurance is disproportionate. You can't actually sell your house because nobody wants to buy it. What do you do? Who's going to sort that out? And the answer is, well, was it the people who built or developed that block of flats 20, 30 years ago? Are they still there? How do you find them? How do you make them pay? It's 30 years on. That's why this gets incredibly complicated.
And then they blame the suppliers and the manufacturers of the components, and then they will say, well, this was legal at the time, so isn't the government ultimately responsible, which then comes back to other people as taxpayers. But I know people with properties, you just can't sell them. You're trapped. You're frozen. And I think that's a bigger issue to them rather than the safety, actually. It's just you cannot move.
You will be pleased to know we're going to be speaking to the Building Safety Minister, Alex Norris, at 8:30 this morning, so we'll get some answers on
We can
that.
ask him whether sorting out cladding is going to be one of the government's top 5 priorities, or...
And if not, why not?
Or if not, why not? But I mean, this is the trouble with setting 5 priorities. I mean, this is a massive priority for loads of people.
Well, they had to... the Labour government, Keir Starmer, had to rejig who was responsible, because Rushanara Ali, the housing minister, was, and then she'd gone to a conference that was funded by one of those responsible or involved in the Grenfell disaster. And the company.
There's been a lot of churn in that housing department, hasn't there? Kevin, Gito, lovely to see you. We'll see you before the end of the programme. Thanks very much indeed.